Imagine a patient sitting up in a hospital bed. They're completely calm, they're, smiling, and they're reporting absolutely zero pain. But beneath the surface, hidden from the naked eye, their organs are quietly shutting down.
Right, it's a terrifying scenario.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you get the world's smartest AI to spot this hidden crisis and, save their life when that AI is legally forbidden from ever looking at their medical file? Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We've built this one specifically for you to explore this exact high-stakes puzzle.
Because it is a massive puzzle, honestly.
It really is. Today's mission is figuring out how artificial intelligence handles life-or-death decisions when the facts simply don't add up, all while keeping our most sensitive secrets completely locked down.
And, it is a phenomenal paradox. We are talking about the collision of three massive, uncompromising forces here. You've got the bleeding edge of healthcare, the frontier of artificial intelligence, and of course, ironclad data privacy laws. And the stakes literally couldn't be higher. If the AI gets the math wrong, or if the hospital gets the privacy wrong, the consequences are, well, they're immediate and severe.
So the source guiding us through this labyrinth today is this really fascinating new research paper titled 𝗧𝗸𝗏, Privacy-Compliant Agentic Reasoning with Evidence Discordance. But before we uncover the brilliant, almost sneaky way these researchers solve this massive AI puzzle, we first need to establish why an artificial intelligence gets so dangerously confused by a smiling patient in the first place.
Yeah, to understand the algorithmic failure, we really have to understand the clinical reality first. In medicine, doctors and nurses are generally trained to look for alignment, right?
Like things making sense together.
Exactly. If a patient's internal systems are failing, they usually look and feel like they are failing. But there is this terrifying phenomenon known as cryptic shock or occult hypoperfusion.
Occult hypoperfusion. Wow.
Yeah, technical term. But basically, this is a medical state where a patient's subjective presentation, so, how they look to the room, what they say out loud, directly contradicts their objective physiological measurements.
So they look completely fine, but mathematically they are dying.
That is the grim reality of it, yeah. You have this incredibly dangerous divergence. The sensory inputs, the patient's demeanor, they're telling the clinical team that things are totally stable, but the underlying physiological sensors are screaming that the body is failing to deliver oxygen to vital organs.
So to really study how AI handles this specific nightmare scenario, the researchers behind our source paper actually had to build a new, highly specific data set, right?
They did, yeah. They call it 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏.
𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏.
Mm-hmm.
And they derived this from a massive, widely recognized electronic health record data set called 𝗬𝗵𝗎4. They essentially filtered through thousands of records to isolate the absolute most confusing, contradictory cases they could find. Just pure discordance.
And they didn't just eyeball it either. They defined this discordance using very, very strict clinical criteria. They wanted to test the AI on the exact moments where human intuition is most likely to fail.
Okay, let's unpack this because we really need to look at those exact numbers.
Mm-hmm.
They paint such a vivid picture of the trap here. So first, the patient's chart says they have a pain score of exactly 0, literally no pain.
Right.
Second, their RAS score is between 0 and -2.
And let me just clarify that for anyone who hasn't worked in an ICU, RSS stands for the Richmond Agitation Sedation Scale.
Right, the RAS.
Yeah, it is a standard bedside assessment used to gauge a patient's level of agitation or sedation. So a score of 0 means the patient is perfectly alert and calm.
Okay.
If they drift down to -1 or -2, it just means they are slightly drowsy or, lightly sedated. The key takeaway is that they are peaceful. They are not thrashing around. They're not combative.
All right, so subjectively, to anyone walking into that hospital room, this patient looks great, they aren't in pain, they are resting peacefully. But then you look at the raw, objective data coming out of the machines. Their mean arterial pressure, their MAP, has dropped below 65 millimeters of mercury, and it's been down there for over 5 minutes.
Which is an absolute klaxon warning. I mean, an MAP below 65 indicates that the patient's systemic perfusion has dropped below a critical threshold.
Meaning what exactly?
Put simply, their organs are no longer getting enough blood flow to survive.
Wow. So the data set flags this by looking at something called the SOFA score, which measures overall organ dysfunction. For these patients, the data set notes an increase of 2 or more points on the SOFA score within the next 12 hours.
And an increase of 2 points on a SOFA score isn't just a minor blip, right? That indicates clinically meaningful, severe organ deterioration. These patients are actively crashing even while they sit there and tell you they feel fine.
If I'm visualizing this correctly, it's kind of like driving a car, where the check engine light is just glaring red on the dashboard, but the engine itself is purring perfectly smoothly.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
The sensory input, the sound of the engine, is telling you everything is fine. But the diagnostic sensor is telling you a catastrophic failure is imminent. So here's my question. When we introduce a standard AI into this environment, does it just read the text that says purring engine or patient appears calm and assume everything is fine? Like, does it really just ignore the flashing red math?
What's fascinating here is that we often assume AI is purely mathematical and objective, right? Like it's just a calculator.
Exactly.
But standard single-pass large language models are, at their core, language engines. They are trained on vast amounts of human narrative. Because of this, they suffer from a massive structural flaw called automation bias.
Meaning they prefer words over numbers.
Precisely. When an LLM reads clinical notes, it heavily overweights reassuring textual cues. If the doctor's note says patient appears calm or no pain, the AI latches onto that narrative. It forms a story.
It wants the story to make sense.
Right. And once it has that reassuring story, it actively downplays or completely ignores the subtle, alarming math of the dropping blood pressure. It assumes the human observation is the ground truth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so when subjective text and objective evidence clash, standard AI models fail completely. They aren't structurally designed to reconcile conflicting truths, you know? They are designed to predict the most likely next word in a story. And the story here says calm.
Planting a flag here for a second, that automation bias has to extend far beyond the hospital. If you are listening to this and you work in finance or law or cybersecurity, you deal with this too. You have moments where the textual narrative, say a glowing press release from a company, completely contradicts the terrifying objective data in their quarterly earnings.
That is a brilliant connection, yeah. Whenever you have a system that processes both human sentiment and hard data, you run the very real risk of the AI choosing the comforting narrative over the alarming math.
Which is terrifying when that AI is supposed to be making a life-saving or company-saving decision. So the obvious question you might be asking is, if standard AI struggles with this, why not just bring in the heavy artillery? Why not use the biggest, smartest, most advanced AI models on the planet, like a GPT-4 or a GPT-5 class model, to solve the puzzle?
And this brings us crashing right into the legal and structural roadblocks. We enter what the researchers effectively frame as a privacy catch-22. The dual model dilemma.
Lay out the two sides of this dilemma for us.
Sure. So on one side, you have the massive proprietary models. These are hosted in remote corporate clouds, right?
Yeah.
And because of their sheer scale, they are undeniably the best in the world at complex, nuanced reasoning.
They're the geniuses.
Exactly. They have the abstract logical capacity to figure out the cryptic shock puzzle, to see past the text and recognize the math.
But they're locked out of the building.
Yes. Because of incredibly strict patient privacy laws, like HIPAA in the United States or GDPR in Europe, it is fundamentally illegal to send sensitive raw patient data out of the hospital secure network to a third-party corporate server. You just cannot take John Doe blood pressure 60, RASS0, and beam it up to an open cloud model. It's a massive legal violation.
Okay, so the smartest models are legally banned from looking at the data. What is the alternative on the other side of the dilemma?
Well, on the other side, you have open source local models. We are talking about models like GPT-𝗏𝗏, 𝗏𝗏𝗏, or 𝗏𝗏𝗏. Because their underlying code is open, a hospital can legally download them, install them on their own internal, air-gapped, highly secure servers, and run them locally.
Meaning they're legally allowed to sit in the room and look at the raw patient data.
They can look at all the data. But here's the brutal trade-off. These open-source models lack the massive parameters and high-level reasoning capabilities of their proprietary counterparts.
So what actually happens when these local models try to untangle this contradictory cryptic shock data all by themselves? Because the paper mentioned something called the degenerate one-class collapse, which just sounds like a catastrophic failure.
Oh, it is a catastrophic failure, and it's driven by essentially mathematical panic.
Mathematical panic.
Yeah, when the local model looks at the data, it gets completely confused by the conflicting evidence. The calm patient versus the crashing blood pressure, it doesn't know which signal to trust. So to minimize its own error rate, it essentially gives up on making nuanced decisions. It collapses into guessing the exact same outcome for every single patient just to play it statistically safe.
Wait, really? It just blankets the same diagnosis on everyone?
Yes. If 80% of the patients in a ward are generally fine, the AI will just predict no deterioration for everyone. It completely loses its ability to differentiate between a genuinely stable patient and a patient showing cryptic shock. It becomes practically useless.
Wow. Think about it like a really frustrating puzzle. It's like the smartest, most experienced doctor in the world is standing on the sidewalk outside the hospital, but their key card is revoked and they aren't allowed to see the patients. Meanwhile, a first-year medical student who was allowed inside the room keeps looking at these conflicting medical charts, completely panicking, and just diagnosing every single patient with the exact same thing to avoid getting yelled at.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. You have immense capability locked outside and legal data access locked inside, but neither entity can solve the problem alone.
Which brings us to the massive breakthrough in this paper. How do we solve this catch-22? The researchers introduced a master workaround called the CARE framework.
Right, CARE. It stands for Privacy-Compliant Agentic Reasoning. It is an asymmetric hybrid framework that builds a secure bridge between the locked-out doctor and the panicked medical student without ever breaking a single privacy rule.
And it operates in 4 distinct stages. Let's walk through the mechanics of how this actually works, because this is where the magic happens.
Yeah, so stage one is about establishing the ground rules without exposing any secrets. The remote proprietary model, so the smart one in the cloud, creates a generic rubric or a logical schema. But here is the trick. It bases this solely on the metadata of the task.
So it's not looking at patient data at all. It's looking at, like, the instruction manual for the hospital.
Correct. It looks at the definitions of the medical features, what a MAP score is or what a RAS score is, and the overall goal of predicting deterioration. It sees absolutely zero patient data. It just builds a blank logical framework. Then the local model securely takes that blank rubric and applies the actual private patient data to it internally. This allows the local model to assign an initial state to the patient.
Okay, so the local model has a starting point. Then we move to stage 2. This is where the local model does a kind of self-check. It looks at the initial state it just assigned and asks, based on this, do I have enough evidence or do I need to dig deeper into the patient's chart? It's a targeted data acquisition step.
But inevitably, with cryptic shock, the local model realizes the data is conflicting and it just doesn't know what to do. Which brings us to stage 3. And this is truly the heart of the framework.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting, because if the local model is confused, it still can't send the patient's vitals to the cloud to ask for help. So how does it communicate? Well, the remote model now receives a completely anonymized, abstract view of the patient's state. It doesn't see John Doe, blood pressure 60. It just sees abstract categories.
All right.
It sees that objective feature A is heavily clashing with subjective feature B. Based purely on this abstract logic puzzle, the remote model provides transition guidance. It sends back a set of logical rules on how to move from one state to another when those specific variables conflict.
And then the local model takes that high-level advice, merges it with the hidden raw patient values it has on site, and mathematically updates the patient's state.
Let me upgrade our earlier analogy to picture how this abstraction actually works. Think of it like a master chef and a line cook.
Okay, I like this.
The proprietary AI is the master chef, stuck outside the restaurant on a phone line. The open source AI is the line cook, in the kitchen with all the ingredients. The line cook doesn't know how to fix a ruined dish, but they aren't allowed to tell the chef what's in it. So they speak in abstract code. The line cook says, "Chef, I have a liquid dish where ingredient A is clashing wildly with flavor profile B."
Right.
And the chef replies, "When A clashes with B in a liquid environment, you must apply an acid to break the tension." The chef solves the logic puzzle without ever knowing it's chicken soup. And the line cook, who has the lemon juice, applies the fix.
That perfectly illustrates the mechanism. The abstraction is the shield that protects the privacy. And the ingenuity of stage 3 is that it relies on what the researchers call disagreement-aware, state transition-based reasoning.
Disagreement-aware, meaning it knows it's being lied to by the text.
It specifically targets the contradiction. Instead of letting the local AI make one rushed, panicked guess from confusing data, the CARE framework forces the system to isolate the disagreement. The remote model explicitly teaches the local model how to weigh conflicting evidence step by step.
But hold on, let me push back here. If the local model, our line cook, was prone to one class collapse earlier and was completely panicking, why should we trust it to apply the master chef's advice in stage 4? Couldn't the local model just mess up the final step and guess the same thing for everyone anyway?
That is a crucial question. And the answer lies in how stage 4 is structured. Stage 4 is the final decision, yes. But the local model isn't just making a wild guess anymore. It is forced to make its final prediction based on the accumulated reasoning trace generated in stage 3. The framework uses something called programmatic gating.
Programmatic gating. Translating that into plain English, it means the local model is put on rails.
Very much so. It enforces a rigid logical structure. The local model can't just skip to the end and panic guess. It must mathematically combine the remote model's transition rules with its own local data, step by step. It's essentially filling in the blanks of a very strict formula provided by the master chef. The raw data never left the building, privacy is maintained, but the panicked guesswork is entirely eliminated.
Okay, so we have the theory. We have the brilliant communication via abstract code. But theory is one thing. The ultimate question is, does this elaborate dual-brain setup actually save lives in practice? Let's get into the results.
Yeah, the researchers ran an extensive experimental evaluation using a 1,000-sample balanced benchmark from that 𝗏𝗏𝗏 dataset, and they tested CARE against multiple baselines.
We already know the standard single-pass models failed and collapsed.
Wow.
But the paper also mentions they tested multi-agent voting systems, models like 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and 𝗧𝗵𝗲. What are those, and do they fare any better?
So 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 are frameworks where, instead of one local AI, you have multiple local AI agents that argue with each other. They debate the data to try and reach a consensus.
So a committee of panicked medical students yelling at each other.
That is precisely why they failed. Having multiple average models debate a problem they inherently don't understand doesn't generate new intelligence, It just reinforces their shared blind spots. Even with a debate framework, they couldn't handle the objective discordance. They still collapsed into predicting the exact same outcome for everyone.
Wow. But then they tested the CARE framework. They used either GPT-OSS or Quinn as the local line cook and a proprietary GPT-5 class model as the remote master chef. What did the numbers actually look like?
The performance leap was massive. CARE achieved significantly stronger results across the board. And they didn't just measure this with standard accuracy, because standard accuracy can be a total liar in medical datasets. Well, if 90% of your patients are fine, an AI can achieve 90% accuracy just by guessing fine every single time, which is that degenerate collapse we talked about.
Yeah.
So the researchers used much stricter statistical metrics. They used G-mean, which balances how well the model identifies both the stable patients and the crashing patients, and the Matthews correlation coefficient, or MCC.
And MCC is sort of the truth-teller metric here.
It is. MCC only gives a high score if the AI is genuinely predicting true positives, true negatives, false positives, and false negatives correctly. It mathematically proves the AI isn't just guessing the majority class. And across both G-mean and MCC, CARE vastly outperformed every single baseline. It completely avoided the degenerate collapse and made nuanced, highly accurate, differentiated predictions for each individual patient.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the brilliance here isn't just that it works. It's that it works out of the box. Previous multi-agent debate systems often required extensive additional training data just to calibrate how confident the different AI agents should be.
Which is incredibly expensive and time-consuming. Low-resource clinics just don't have the compute power or the budget to train massive new models. But CARE operates in a zero-shot setting. Because of that programmatic gating we discussed, it forces the AIs to cooperate accurately immediately, without any extra training.
Now, earlier I mentioned planting a flag. For those of you working in finance or law, I want you to think about your own professional life right now, because the implications of this go way beyond a hospital ICU. Whether you are analyzing volatile financial markets, digging through complex legal case files, or trying to predict erratic consumer behavior, you are dealing with two massive headaches: conflicting data streams and strict privacy or compliance rules.
Yeah, the real world rarely gives you a clean, single narrative. The text and the math will always clash eventually.
And the CARE framework isn't just a medical tool. It is a fundamental blueprint for how we can deploy artificial intelligence safely in any high-stakes, confusing environment where privacy is non-negotiable. It shows us how to separate the abstract reasoning power of a massive AI from the sensitive, private ground truth data that it's reasoning about.
It proves that we don't have to compromise. For years, the assumption was that you had to choose between having the smartest AI in the cloud and keeping your data private on local servers. By structuring the architecture to communicate purely through abstract logic, we can actually have both.
It is an incredibly hopeful piece of research. So let's briefly recap the journey we've been on today. We started with the deadly confusion of cryptic shock, where a patient's calm words mask a failing body, triggering a dangerous automation bias that tricks standard AI systems into ignoring the math. We explored the catch-22 of privacy laws locking the smartest AI out of the room, leaving local models to panic and collapse into guesswork. And finally, we uncovered the ingenious solution: the CARE framework, a dual-brain, privacy-compliant architecture that uses remote abstract guidance and local data processing to logically untangle conflicting evidence without ever leaking a single sensitive secret.
It represents a profound shift in how we structure machine reasoning. It moves us away from blind trust in a single, flawed model and towards verifiable, structured collaboration between specialized systems.
So what does this all mean? We've seen how brilliantly this AI framework handles discordance in clinical data. By splitting its brain into abstract reasoning and local reality, it can see through the noise when subjective signs and objective signals clash. But it leaves me with a final, slightly provocative thought for you to take away.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. What is it?
If an AI framework like CARE can successfully resolve these deep contradictory signals by isolating the facts from the narrative, what happens when we start applying this architecture to our own lives? Think about human psychology. Think about how often our own subjective words, what we say we want, what we tell our partners we feel, completely conflict with our objective actions. If an AI can be trained to systematically ignore the reassuring narrative and focus purely on the underlying reality, could an architecture like CARE eventually diagnose our own internal human contradictions better than we can understand ourselves? Could AI know that we are emotionally crashing, even when we are smiling and saying we are perfectly fine? I want you to mull that over. It's a heavy thought, but a fascinating one. Until the next deep dive.